Today, I'm going to be answering your questions about grief, starting with how do people grieve? One of the things I like to say about grief is on the one hand, we don't say to ourselves, gee, when's that person coming back? It's sort of taking them a long time. We understand that they can't come back. At the same time, we don't say, well, they're never coming back, so I guess I just might as well move on, right? And I call that chasm between those 2 grief. That's what grieving is all about. It's about acknowledging reality. That doesn't mean that we don't also have a reaction to it that is important to recognize and to process. It should not be dismissed, right, or bottled up. You need to do both of those things when you're grieving. How do people grieve? One of the things that I tell people is to think of grieving like a job. And the reason I say that is because we're really good in our society about making time for work. And you need to do the same thing when it comes to grieving. You need to be deliberate about it, finding opportunities or ways of getting in touch with your emotions, whether it be talking with someone or listening to music that reminds you of that person, looking over photos, any number of those sorts of things. Because if you don't do that, what's going to happen is the grief is going to interfere when you don't want it to, and then that can cause other problems because it interferes with your ability to function, your daily life. Um, on the other hand, if you do take time for your grief, then it makes it a lot easier to compartmentalize it. And so if you're in the middle of doing something and it's not a good time to be um, getting in touch with your grief, it's much easier for you to be able to say, this is not a good time, but I know that I'm going to be addressing it later. And so the grief is um, much more likely to not interfere because of that, because you're making time for it. How do people grieve? You've heard me talk about the necessity of feeling, how they are a survival mechanism, and that they provide information of a need or a threat that we are overlooking. Sometimes those needs are more long term, and sometimes the threat could be something that's not immediate, but something to be looking out for. Grief is a little different in this regard. Grief is trying to tell us what we need, usually in that moment. And so, anytime you find yourself feeling sad, you want to ask yourself, what do I need right now? And this will make sense if you think about it in terms of what you do for other people. If you know that somebody is grieving, what do you normally say to them? I'm so sorry that you're going through this. Is there anything I can do for you? Well, it's no different when you're talking to yourself. It's acknowledging the grief and then asking yourself, what do I need in this moment? And it could be any number of things, some type of self care, talking to somebody, processing your grief through journaling or looking at pictures or listening to music that reminds you of that person. And so it's really important to remember when you are grieving that you ask yourself what you need in that moment. Next question, how do people cope with grief and loss? There's 2 ways to cope with grief. You can be proactive or you can be reactive. So when you're reactive, you are basically dismissing your grief, bottling it up, not giving it the attention that it needs. And so what happens is the grief doesn't go away. It just inserts itself into your life in reactionary ways, and that will affect your behavior. And that's when we make bad decisions or we do things that we normally wouldn't if we were maybe something more thoughtful about it. So you want to be proactive. And so what does that mean? That means taking time for your grief. I talk about thinking of grief like a job. So if you're making time for your grief, that means that you are deliberately processing your feelings and finding different outlets for doing that. Obviously, therapy would be an example of that, or some sort of support group, or journaling, or talking it out with other family members or friends, etc. And so when you do that, then you are able to compartmentalize your grief and you're able to be thoughtful about how you want to express your grief, right? It's not going to just cause you to react in ways in which you might get angry or anxious or depressed, right? Because you're not dealing with it. So I want to give you an example. This was someone that I was working with who lost her husband quite a few years prior to her coming to see me. She was having trouble moving on, and she had, in fact, met someone who was very devoted to her and wanted her to move in with him. She spent a lot of time over at his house, but she was very conflicted about whether or not she really wanted to even be in a relationship with this man. And so one day when we were talking, she mentioned to me that she had recommended that her husband get a second opinion. He died of cancer. And he was adamant that he trusted this oncologist and did not want to get a second opinion. And so as we were talking through this, I reflected back to her that it sounded like she was angry at her husband for this, for not seeking that second opinion. And she was not very happy with or trusting of this one oncologist. And she responded insisting that she wasn't angry at her husband. And, I told her, I said, it's okay to be angry with him. You cared about him, you loved him, you wanted him to seek a second opinion. So it's okay to be angry with him about it. But she kept insisting that she wasn't. What was interesting about that is that the next time I saw her, probably a week or two later, suddenly she was telling me how she was feeling a lot better and that she was ready to move in with her boyfriend, that she was setting boundaries with family members when up till that point she was having trouble doing that. And this was during COVID. So she was an older lady. So she was concerned about getting COVID, and some of the family members didn't want to wear a mask in her house. But she was more confident now in setting boundaries with those family members. And so I thought to myself, well, I think I know where this is coming from. And yet I didn't say anything to her about it. I just noted the juxtaposition of her acknowledging and forgiving herself for being angry at her husband. And I think that that was what was keeping her stuck, because right after that conversation, she made progress that she'd been struggling to make for several years. I'm talking about ways that people cope with grief and loss. And I want to talk now about what's called complicated bereavement or complicated grief. So, when we have a loving relationship with unconditional love and it's very positive, then when they pass away, we feel sad, obviously. It's very straightforward. They're gone, we miss them. However, majority of the time, our relationships are not straightforward like that. There's been hurt, disappointment, frustration, humiliation, abandonment, abuse of right? Different dynamics have gone into the relationship with that loved one. So the relationship, in other words, is complicated. And so when that happens, when that person passes away, grief is complicated. We don't just feel sadness, we feel all of those other feelings that we have felt in that relationship. Those feelings come to the surface as well. And so it becomes a very complicated process. You're going to experience all of those different feelings, and all of those different feelings have to be processed and resolved. And that's when it's particularly important to go to a therapist to talk out those different feelings and where they're coming from, and learning different ways of coping with those feelings and resolving them. And even just being aware that they're there, because a lot of times we have bottled up those feelings. And so we may not have dealt with them at all until suddenly that person passes away. And then all of a sudden, we're experiencing all these feelings that maybe we weren't even aware of, or we're certainly not taking the time to process. I'm talking about how people cope with grief and loss. One of the things that often comes up in my sessions is patients will say to me, I did better this week because they didn't cry or they weren't as down. And I point out to them that, the goal isn't necessarily not to cry or not to feel sad. That's part of grieving. And so I think to qualify it in that way as good or bad sort of sets up an unrealistic expectation, and also an unhealthy one, because it is important to grieve. I mean, it's part of the process of getting through grief is to allow yourself to feel sad and to vent that sadness, recalling memories and looking at old photos and engaging in those kinds of activities is important. It's necessary. And the more you allow yourself to vent your sadness, the more quickly you will work through your grief. Otherwise, you can end up prolonging it. How do people cope with grief and loss? Unfortunately, one of the common sources of grief that I've been encountering over the years is accidental overdose. So I work with a lot of parents and sometimes children that have lost a parent to overdose. And needless to say, this is one of the most emotionally painful experiences that one can encounter. And so one of the things that I try to teach people is to think of this sadness like you would a wave washing over you on the beach. So if you imagine you're sitting by the ocean and suddenly a wave washes over you, the best thing to do is not to panic, because if you did, you might breathe in salt water and get disoriented, right? But if you say to yourself, I know that this is just a wave, it's going to wash over me and then it's going to wane, and, it's temporary, that is the best way to process those kinds of deep wrenching bouts of sadness, do that, you are much more likely to shorten the experience. If you fight it, you're much more likely to prolong it. Not just that particular instance, but over time as well. I'm answering the question, how do people cope with grief and loss? A common experience is people feeling guilt for experiencing moments of joy. Of course, you have to go on with your life, and most of the time, we have other people in our lives that need us, rely on us, and for that reason alone, want to find some way to continue on with life and be able to experience the joy that life has to offer. I often will point out in the case in which a person died through drugs or through suicide that it takes a lot of strength to continue to move on through life and to find joy, and that these loved ones were not able to do that, and you are, and that makes you a strong person. So part of being strong is being able to move forward and live your life. I hear a lot from my patients fear that if they allow themselves to feel joy, that they will forget their loved one. They might even think about how it might appear to other people or perhaps to the loved one themselves. And so we talk about finding that new normal. So it's about finding a way of straddling these two seemingly opposing feelings, that is, experiencing joy and experiencing grief. But that is your new normal. It's not a matter of one versus the other. Like you can only be sad, or if you allow yourself to have joy, that means that you're forgetting your loved ones, or you may feel guilty because you are allowed to go on experience life and your loved one isn't. All of these are normal feelings that people experience during grief. It's not a matter of one versus the other, but looking at it like these are both a part of you, and they're going to be both a part of your moving forward. So times when you allow yourself to be in the present moment and experience joy, and there'll be times when you reflect back and you will take the time to process your grief. And both are important and both can coexist. And so that's really important to remember, that it's okay to feel both and to expect that you will feel both. Rosie's here to help me answer this next question, which is, what is the difference between loss and grief? Well, there are many times in our lives when we might experience a loss that is something other than losing a loved one, such as ending a relationship, losing a job, moving away, medical conditions that might limit our physical ability can be a loss, and the impact of dysfunctional parents, what we didn't get during our upbringing, that can also be a loss. And so there are many times in our lives when, even if we understand the reason why there was this loss, and even if it's a good reason, you're still entitled to experience those feelings of loss, and to make sure that you identify what exactly it is that's causing it and what's in your control. Because when it comes to loss, we often do feel hopeless or helpless. And so it's important to make sure that you identify the things that are in your control. If you found this helpful, be sure to like and subscribe so that you get to hear more of your mental health questions answered. Also, please share this video with anyone that you feel might need to hear it. And if you have any questions of your own, enter them in the comment section below this video. Talk to you soon.